Alright, so all of us have heard of Sakhis, or stories of the Guru, and they play an integral part in our understanding or conception of Sikhi. But where do these stories come from, right? What are the source of these stories? Most of us have heard of Janam Sakhis, but the Janam Sakhi literature only deals with the stories of Guru Nanak. So what about the stories of Guru Angad, up to Guru Gobind Singh? Perhaps there was a text in the past that was the gold standard for the community when they were looking at history. And this is why I'm speaking today about Suraj Prakash. So the Gurpratap Suraj Prakash Granth, or for short, the Suraj Prakash, which was written in 1843, was the most comprehensive, detailed, historical book written dealing with the lives of all the 10 gurus. This text was the gold standard for history since its inception and continues to this day to be learned and read, even in the diaspora. So this paper intends to shed light on the origin of the text by examining the author, his context, and the text reception within the community since its inception, but continued to this day. So Santokh Singh, the author, was born in northwestern Punjab in the year 1788 to Deva Singh and Ram Devi, and belonged to the Shipa, or the cloth-making caste. And it's a real testament to the egalitarian nature of the Sikh community at that time, that Santokh Singh, coming from a low caste, could so highly be educated, and also his text would receive widespread institutional backing. Much of Santokh Singh's early childhood, up until the age of 11, was spent learning from his father, who was also an accomplished scholar on Sikh scripture. And it was around that time, at the age of 11, when Deva Singh and his son traveled to Amritsar, where he entrusted Santokh Singh to Gyani Sant Singh to lead his son's teaching further. So Gyani Sant Singh was known to be a resident of the Gyaniya Bunga, or the Bunga, or the institution of learning of Gyanis. So if you look to this map, number 47, that's where the Gyani Bunga used to be. It's currently no longer there. So although Gyani Sant Singh was known to be a respectable Gyani, it did not appear that he had many other students, and certainly not many others that wrote as extensively as Santokh Singh. But Sant Singh's rise to fame actually came through saving Maharaja Ranjit Singh's life in battle. And then subsequently, Sant Singh received gracious patronage from Ranjit Singh, and where he would take care of the duties of Harmandir Sahib and also perform Katha, discourse, to the congregation. Sant Singh was also in charge of refurbishing the Harmandir Sahib, supervising the installation of the copper plates gilded in gold on the exterior of Harmandir Sahib. So here's an inscription that mentions Sant Singh's role in the refurbishing of Harmandir Sahib. This is still there. So although Sant Singh was not known for teaching, he did compose a very lengthy Braj version of Tulsidasa's Ramachartmanas, the life stories of Rama, which to this date have been unexamined. It was under Sant Singh that Santokh Singh then would learn Braj Bhasha as well as Sanskrit for the next 10 years. Following the completion of his studies, Santokh Singh spent some time traveling across Punjab and also spent time in Banaras before returning to Punjab in the city of Budi, where he began his first composition, the Nam Kosh, which is a Braj version of the famous Sanskrit Amar Kosh dictionary. It was soon after this composition, which was completed in 1823, that Santokh Singh began writing the Nanak Prakash, which is a Braj poetic hagiography of the life of Guru Nanak. Santokh Singh completed this major composition at the age of 36 in the city of Amritsar in the year of 1824. During this time, it was said that along with composing this poetry, Santokh Singh would perform Katha, discourse, to the local congregations in the nearby areas. The attention that arose from Nanak Prakash, along with the public discourse, attracted the eyes of many major institutions and players in Punjab. For a short period of time, Santokh Singh was under the patronage of Raja Karam Singh of Patiala, but then was called by the King of Kathal, Raja Uday Singh, where he was very generously sponsored, enabling him to write the majority of his works while remaining in Kathal for the rest of his life. This is a kabit written by Kavi Santokh Singh to Raja Uday Singh. So the city-state region of Kathal, which Uday Singh was the king of, in the district of Karnal, was founded during the Misl period by Uday Singh's grandfather, Desu Singh, in 1767. Soon after Uday Singh's death in 1843, the state folded into the British Raj. So it was here in Kathal where Santokh Singh would write the 4 of his remaining 6 works. In addition to Naam Kosh and Nanak Prakash, Santokh Singh wrote Garab Ganjani Tika, which is a commentary on Guru Nanak's Japji Sahib. He also wrote a Braj version of Atma Puran and the Valmiki Ramayana. And his last composition, the Suraj Prakash, which was the life history of the remaining 9 gurus. Actually, the commentary, Garab Ganjani Tika and Suraj Prakash, are the only works of Santokh Singh that are currently published. So the collection of works of Santokh Singh and his life provides an interesting insight into the literary culture of that period. This engagement by Santokh Singh into a wider and larger literary heritage does not necessarily require devotional or sectarian membership. As mentioned before, Nanak Prakash, which was written 2 decades prior to Suraj Prakash, but is commonly published since the 1920s, they have been combined. The combined version has 22 sections of all, which relate to the movement and the illumination of the sun. So the title Gurpratap Suraj Prakash is meant to analogize the sun's illuminating rays with the Guru's glory. As such, the Nanak Prakash is divided into 2 sections: the Purabard, the rising of the sun from sunrise to midday, and the second portion being the Uttarard, meaning the setting from the sun from midday to sunset. The chapters are called Anshus, meaning a ray of light from the sun. Following the Nanak Prakash, there are 12 sections called Ras, meaning months. These 12 chapters are the life stories of Guru Angad to Guru Tegh Bahadur. They're divided here. The rest of the Suraj Prakash is dedicated to Guru Gobind Singh. In the next 6 sections, they're called Rut, the 6 seasons in India. The concluding 2 chapters are called Dakhanan and Uttaran. The Dakhanan refers to the December solstice, when the sun is at its most southern point in relation to the Earth's equator. The decline of the sun southward occurs from June 21st to ending around December 21st. The last section, Suraj Prakash, is the Uttaran, or the summer solstice, starting from around December 21st, going till around June 21st. This is when the sun slowly rises north in relation to the Earth's equator. So in beginning of month 1, following Nanak Prakash, Santokh Singh outlines both the purpose for the composition along with the sources that he uses. So Santokh Singh himself describes the desire to assemble and compile a complete history of the Guru's lives. So he writes, the history of the Gurus within this world is not found all together in one spot. Just like within sand one can obtain gold, but with a sieve one is able to obtain gold through extraction. Thus from the world I will extract all the history of the Gurus, and I will write down the entire history. The majority of the Suraj Prakash, according to Santokh Singh, is derived from the stories written down by Ram Kaur and his associates. The Ram Kaur, according to Santokh Singh, was a famed Sikh who, after taking initiation at the hands of Guru Gobind Singh, came to be known as Gurbaksh Singh. Ram Kaur's lineage goes back to Baba Buddha, whose long life enabled him to live through the duration of the first 6 gurus. An extensive portion of the 2nd chapter is dedicated in praise to Baba Buddha ji, and then anchoring Ram Kaur to Baba Buddha. Ram Kaur, having spent an extensive time with Guru Gobind Singh and also being a descendant of Baba Buddha, was thus perhaps assumed to have inherited the stories of the first gurus as well as Guru Gobind Singh. The history was then written down by a scribe, Sahib Singh, along with Ram Kaur, and somehow found its way to Santokh Singh while in Kathal, becoming his primary source. While Santokh Singh used these now inaccessible and unknown stories from Ram Kaur, he also mentions using stories by Mani Singh, who is said to have written Sikhandi Bhagatmala, which is an anthology of stories relating to various Sikhs from the times of the Gurus. It's possible that Santokh Singh used other literature from the Gurbalas era. So Gurbalas Pasha Shemi, whose author Bhagat Singh says his source was also by Mani Singh. In addition to Ramkot and Mani Singh's writings, Santokh Singh mentions how he traveled Punjab, picking up stories wherever he could find them. So Santokh Singh was so widely praised for his work that he was largely given the title Chudamani and Mahakavi. Chudamani meaning the crown jewel of poets, and Mahakavi meaning the great poet. And in Indic tradition, this was only reserved for one poet, Kalidasa, the most renowned Sanskrit poet. So here's an example of just one of the many literary devices used in Santokh Singh's poetics. This particular device is called the Singh Avlokan, or the sight of a tiger. And it refers to when, after a successful hunt, a tiger periodically looks to its rear to ensure that no prey is coming to steal its catch. And in metaphorical terms, this means when one periodically stops, pauses, and then reflects upon a task before continuing with their task. So in poetics here, we see that the final word of the first verse is used in the first word of the next verse. And this beautiful passage here is part of the concluding portion of Suraj Prakash. So, तार अपूर्व अपूर्व रूप पाए गुरु नानक जोत उदार हैं धार के दो नर पंथ परे तन से जग सागर ते पर पार हैं पारत है गुण टारत अवगुण ज्ञान सखारत बाग विचार हैं चारों वेद उचार हैं सारे बंद हों अब मोहे उदार हैं. You can see how the last word of the first verse links with the next, and the next with the next, and it creates this chain. And this goes on. I've only clipped these two verses. So oral tradition within the Gyani tradition claims that upon completing Suraj Prakash, Santokh Singh personally delivered the first handwritten copy to Akal Takht, where a proclamation was made that it would be standard practice that its recitation and its discourse be done every evening. And this was a tradition that carried on through all of the 5 takhts. So to this day, this tradition happens. If you go to any of the 5 takhts today, you'll find in the evening time they do Katha of Suraj Prakash. Actually, at Takht Huzur Sahib just recently, they just finished with Suraj Prakash, the entire, and now they've started Panth Prakash. Huzur Sahib is a Takht that has both Suraj Prakash and Panth Prakash on rotation. And beyond the major institutions like the Takhts, the Suraj Prakash is still taught amongst the traditional learning institutions, such as the Satugali Tiksal in Amritsar, the Damdami Tiksal, the Nirmalas, and in select Nahang groups as well. And the real testament to the current reach of Suraj Prakash is viewing its influence in the diaspora, where more than a handful of gurdwaras, both in Canada, America, England as well, have daily discourse of Suraj Prakash. The lasting reach of Suraj Prakash is a testament to the great ability of Santokh Singh on both substance and style. And although no current translations, full translations exist of the text, there are many resources online where you can still engage with the text. So if you're good in Punjabi, you can listen to Punjabi Katha on gurmatvichar.com. They have the original text there on ekateran.com. There's also some English translations of the Nanak Prakash, the beginning chapters related to Guru Nanak, on Sikh Scriptures to English.blogspot. I don't believe it's the entire Nanak Prakash, but it's a significant amount that you can begin getting a flavor of the text. And yeah, thank you.
President. So I'm going to ask a few questions before turning it over to the audience to get a chance to ask for clarifications, ask for whatever specific questions that you may have. My first question I'm going to turn to you, Sukhdeep, is you talked about at Takht Huzur Sahib that there was a sort of that sometimes they read Gurpratap Suraj Prakash as well as Pangu's Panth Prakash. I wanted to ask, what is the relationship between the two texts? Is there certain sort of intertextuality? And what did Kavi Santokh Singh draw upon, and what did he also reject from Ratan Singh Pangu? Either way.
This might be easier. Yeah, it's an interesting question because those two texts, people have thought of them as kind of opposed. So first of all, for those who don't know, Panth Prakash, Ratan Singh Pangu's Panth Prakash was written in the early 19th century as well. I think around 1820s, which predates Santokh Singh's Suraj Prakash by maybe 10, 15 years. It's around the same time though. But largely, Ratan Singh Pangu's Panth Prakash focuses on the life of Guru Gobind Singh and afterwards. So the Missal period, how Khalsa got Raj. It was written basically because when the British were in India in the late 18th century, this is like prior to the time of Ranjit Singh, and even coming towards the time of Ranjit Singh, they had asked, I forget the colonel's name, but a colonel, a British soldier, had asked Ratan Singh Pangu how basically Khalsa got Raj. How did they knock down the Mughal Empire? And so Pangu's whole response, the context of his book is written in that light. He's responding to colonial questions about how Sikhs got sovereignty. So he's mainly writing about, the establishment of the Sikh Empire there. So whereas Santokh Singh's writings cover the lifetimes of the gurus, so they're quite different in terms of what they see as sovereignty and what they see as Sikh identity as well. So people have thought of them as, in that sense, opposed, but in one sense, they work on the same continuum because one deals with, prior to the Missal period and one works after. So I think that's why Takht Huzur Sahib has them in rotation. So first they'll have Suraj Prakash, they'll try to get through that, which would take quite a long time to go through it every day. So they'll have that, and then following that, to fill in the rest of the history up until Ranjit Singh, they will have Panth Prakash Katha every day as well.
My name is Jitendra Singh Mundal. My question is directed towards Sukhdeep Singh. You mentioned that Suraj Prakash has been used as a standard historical studies in our Gurdwaras during Katha. GPC has recently commissioned Dr. Gurpratap Singh to re-edit and publish the Suraj Prakash. And during his publishing, which several volumes have been published, Dr. Gurpratap Singh has decided to remove many of the portions and which he considered, in his team's opinion, as anti-Sikh philosophy. That's a major portion of it that has been removed. Do you still believe, after all this, that we should use Suraj Prakash as a standard historical document to teach history? Even a major portion of it is anti-Sikh.
I think that sentiment about portions of Suraj Prakash that may be problematic, that's existed since it was published by Veer Singh in the 1920s. So there are portions within the Suraj Prakash that may not suit well modern readers' engagement with the text. So there are mythological stories in there which people they'll be, this is, did Guru Nanak go to the land of the ants, and this is not possible, so, let's just cut this story out. But a lot of the stories in there are not meant, like a mythological story may not be historically true in the sense of a Western understanding of a historical story. It's maybe driving home different ideas about the philosophy. But do I think that editing should exist? I think it would be kind of foolish for us to look back at that text and edit it out. It would probably be better to just look at it as it is and understand it as a product of that time. Because, text prior to that, like Pangu's text, and also texts that come after that, they all have a context. And they're all written in a specific time period, and we should be mindful of that, more so than looking at it and trying to take out, okay, this is good, this is bad. I think that would probably be a better approach to engaging with the Suraj Prakash. Is to understand that text has a context as well. It probably had an audience as well that we should be aware of. And yeah, I think it'd be kind of foolish to go back with our mentality now and try to just take out what we find acceptable and not.
My question is kind of multifold, and it's a question for Sukhdeep Singh, and it's also as well as a rebuttal to certain schools of thought in today. With the Suraj Prakash Granth, I know it details certain things of which the Sikhi may have fallen out of practice, such as Chakka Maryada, Shikar Maryada, the use of Shahidi Deg for assistance in meditation and to sharpen the skills of a Kshatriya or a Sikh or an Ahang in battle. I know you have extensive experience with Singhs in the Gurdwara, the Dal Panth, and you've done extensive research into a lot of things that are put up in that may seem today post-Singh Sabha movement and the creation of the SGPC and certain groups such as the missionaries that have discarded certain things that were unquestionable and everybody followed prior to 1920 and with the establishment of colonialism. Would you say that certain things today in Sikhi that which in my opinion was the watered down colonialized version of it, which most people could come to know, and they do not accept what it was prior, do you feel it is, like you said, foolish to just discard things that may not necessarily seem in line with Sikhi and just stick with things such as certain things that may seem more Hindu, such as texts in Dasam Barni, Sadhru Barni, and basic things within this plain Adi Guru Granth Sahib that may appear as Hindu? Because in my personal belief, in the course that I've done and following up on your research, I've come to believe that if we, by deletion of certain things with our own history, Itihas and Puratan Granths, if we delete everything that seems Hindu, there won't be much left.
I think that's why these texts are interesting to go back and look at, because then we get to see, if anything else, we can see, okay, this is what people in the 19th century thought Sikhi was, if anything else. And then beyond that, we can look at, okay, how these things have changed over time. If you do have a collection of texts from the 19th century, 18th century that mention certain practices, and now we can look and, okay, how come these practices are not currently being done in the Gurdwara, or maybe certain philosophies or certain ways of framing Gurbani, they've gone out of vogue nowadays. Why is that? And then we can get a better light on perhaps the audience shifted, perhaps certain realities in economics have changed, perhaps certain philosophies have lost vogue. So, in the 19th century, we see that Vedanta was very, in style, same with the 18th century. So perhaps that's the reasons why, that framework was placed upon understanding Gurbani at that time. But yeah, if anything else, looking back at these texts, they help us shed light on parts of our history that have been unexamined for a long time. And if you do travel in India and you do go to certain Gurdwaras, maybe outside of Punjab, their conception of Sikhi is different. And that's just interesting because then you can see, okay, why is that different than Punjab? What was the context in Punjab that may have changed our understandings of Sikhi? So yeah, this is why pre-colonial texts are interesting, but we do have to understand that even the pre-colonial texts, like Suraj Prakash, Pant Prakash, and then the ones that came before that, Pansabi Nama, Gurbalas Pashai Shemi, they all had their own context as well. They all had their own authors. They were writing for a specific audience as well that we have to be mindful of. But.
Yeah, I would like to add a comment on the questions for me. I think this is a discussion that Paul Singh deals quite a bit with, which is this idea of why do we have to change the calendar? We already had Bikram calendar. Bikram calendar was there in the Guru's era, and it has been used, for the past couple of centuries. And I think it reminds me, there's one Punjabi poet who says, ਪਾਣੀ ਵਗਦੇ ਰਹਿਣ ਖੜਿਆਂ ਬੁੱਸਦੇ ਨੇ ਵਹਿੰਦਿਆਂ ਸੌਂਦੇ ਨੇ. So the idea is like the waters have to continue flowing, but that's it. So I think if the idea becomes, instead of let's write over this and adopt this, or let's just stick with what is there. I think both of those I find very extreme thought processes. I think the idea should be continuously, as the time changes, as you said, the time has changed. As you continuously evolve, question what is there without replacing what is already there. So I think our instead of just rewriting history, just looking at history from the context of what it was, being in that time, being within that context and exploring it that way, while still looking towards the future and inventing what are the things that we need to address as we move towards the future, right? There's no mention of computation, 100 years ago, but now as a community we have to deal with it, right? So those kind of things, right? So I just wanted to put my thought in it. Thanks. Yeah, please.
I did want to ask something about the non-Akshaya calendar, because it seems strange to me that how do we balance really this? Traditionally, that we see that we have a lot of festivals that we celebrate, Diwali, Holi for like the Hola Mahalla on Holi. Traditionally, we had Dussehra celebrations as well. So there's a long tradition of kind of the community interacting with the broader community as well. So how do we balance the fact that, we're going to make our own calendar, so we're kind of separating. How do we balance that out by, being a part of a larger community as well, which, has historical precedent as well?
I think that's a very good question, because that's a question I constantly, kind of struggled with. And I think and this is again, what I have come to conclusion with, it's not right or wrong. I think one is the idea of separation of faith and the culture. I think within the idea of the faith, or you're exploring things within the context of that very thing, and within the idea of culture, you're exploring all the other associations that you have. I think the other question I have there is, if not Nanak-Shahi calendar, then what, right? Then what is the source of those dates, right? Is the source of those dates then being defined by another tradition, right? Whose some of those things we may agree with, some of the things we might not agree with, right? So I think I do not have the answers for this, but specific answer for how do we reconcile this all. But I think one thing is for sure is that if we continue to observe without defining our own standards of how the dates would be, or what our needs of how do we look at time, and how do we look at the relationship, or how do we look at the relationship of Qurbani within the seasons, all those different things. Those are very faith-specific things, right? Which may not be an addressable problem for the larger community, right? But how do we reconcile these two things together? I think that's a question that is probably for the larger community to address. But I think the alternate, which is not having a calendar of our own and just going with what has been happening, we see that it will have impacts on some of the things that within our own faith, which we have to address sooner or later.
We have about 5 minutes. Any last questions?
Hi, this is to both people on the panel. We talk a lot about understanding context for both of your research. Is there any homework that you would want to give anybody here to kind of understand the context of kind of the economic past or any social movements that were going on at the time for the calendar, or for any sort of text that would help people understand a little bit more, kind of getting into your research?
Sorry?
Their own website.
Yeah, you'd have to have pretty good Punjabi skills to get through that. There are like Tikas, there are commentaries written in Punjabi on Suraj Prakash that you could read. I'm assuming that might be difficult for a lot of the audience. So, I mean, that's part of the struggle in academia now, is that a lot of the pre-modern, the pre-colonial works we were talking about this yesterday. There's no scholarship on like Gurpratap Suraj Prakash. There's no scholarship on Pant Prakash. There's no scholarship on all of these texts prior to the British, right? And that's a huge problem in the West for people like us, right? Because we get fed whatever we hear at the Gurdwara. Somebody tells us, a Gyani tells us, right, at the Gurdwara. We don't know what the source of that is, which is why I found Suraj Prakash so interesting. When they would have Gatha of Suraj Prakash, a Gyani just doesn't come up and just tell you, oh, I heard a story from Suraj Prakash. They always have a tradition where you have a party there reciting the Suraj Prakash, and then the Kathavachik does it line by line, almost to ensure that, okay, there is an authority here. You know, this does go back. This is actually what is written in the text. And that's been a tradition since its inception, which is really interesting, different than today, where you just have a Gyani go up and he can say whatever he wants to say, right? There's no standard. So, I mean, that's really problematic that these texts are kind of lost on the youth here today, that it's inaccessible to them. So homework for that is learn Braj Pasha. It'll take you the next 10 years. If you want to learn anything about these types of texts, so Suraj Prakash is written in Braj Pasha. You can read Alison Bush's Poetry of Kings. It's just an interesting book that gives you insight into the type of poetry that was being written at that time. So that'll also give you insights into Dasam Granth as well. Anything from going from the 18th century to the 19th century, that type of literature, that would also be a Rasi type of literature. It'll give you insight into that. So it's called Poetry of Kings by Alison Bush. But anything Sikh specific, yeah, this is where the scholarship lacks, and this is why you can probably share more on that.
The one thing I would share, and I apologize for cutting you off, Sukdeep, is you know, like a lot of these older scholarships, these like little books you'll see even at like Mele and like even religious ceremonies, like, I mean, these are real jewels. Like if you ever see like Pyara Singh Padam's books, I mean, like, and the Punjabi that's used is not, look, I mean, there's no way to skip over the homework one has to do to just get used to the Gurmukhi alphabet and to just improve your Punjabi, which is people are like Arvinder and Sukdeep in a very different light are doing and have done. But some of those books are really, I mean, that level of scholarship, I mean, today working in a Western institute, I'm blown away of like Jaggi, Pyara Singh Padam and the level that they were able to do, which doesn't mean I like wholeheartedly accept all their conclusions, but you know, where they very, very simply, because it was actually for an audience that wasn't necessarily the most scholarly audience. It was actually a lot of times they're writing for a lay audience. So those types of books that you'll see Singh brothers or like that constantly reproduce, I would really, really highly recommend, just as a learning exercise for yourself, but really possibly as an entryway into some of these texts and some of these issues as well.
Yeah, I think for the Nanak calendar, I would say, you know, the authority of the text is Purval.biz, and there are papers, number of papers there. The predominant one being Gurbani and Nanak calendar. That's a good paper to read and kind of go through, and very well written. In terms of, you know, the Gurmukhi Punjabi context, there are fewer sources out there. There's you know, we run a resource called Punjabi Lab. There's Kuka, Punjabi Kuka. You did quite a bit of work on the Gurmukhi and Punjabi aspect of it. If you want to contribute, there is CLDR, which is the Common Literary Repository Database. It opens up twice every year, and they accept, you know, new translation of strings that go into all the softwares that you see out there. So yeah, I mean, those are some of the resources to get started. And, you know, if you need some more resources, just drop us an email. I think it's on Punjabi Lab. It's just drop us an email. We'll help you out.
Any last questions?
Well, I also want to recently in the last 10 years there's been a deep renewed interest in a lost cycle of time known as a great year to the west, to Plato. Essentially the precession of the equinox of our Earth, a grand cycle of 24,000 years. our Bani does reference this cycle as well as Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapar Yuga, and Kali Yuga, of course, which we are in right now. How do you reconcile this seemingly impossible knowledge that the Earth is round and cycles around a 20,000-year orbit within our Bani? What does that mean to Sikhs in terms of our understanding of the cosmos and our place within it?
No, so you.
Okay. Thanks for the question. I think I haven't looked at that specific text, but I think one of the things when I was looking through Puriwal's paper, he was mentioning there's a lot of reference of a lot of different types of frames of time, right? So there is a Visiyachasi Kadiye Paratiti Vari Mahua. Suraj ek ko Ruttan ek Nana Karte ke Ketis, right? So I think the idea that Puriwal puts in there is that many of these references, like gurus observed the natural phenomena not as to observe them, but to use them, like they use them as reference in Gurbani to convey a different message. So I'm not specifically aware of that particular problem that you're talking about, but I'll look into more. But I think one of the ideas that I want to put in there is from the calendar's perspective. From what I have read so far, the idea was that yes, there are certain frames or certain measurements or certain units of time that have been, that are not in use. There are a variety of different units in time, and there are certain ones that are chosen. You want to say something?
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned that Banda Bahadur, so he declared a year zero, and then he said that, okay, now we are starting Satyug right now. So it's interesting how he used a different frame as well there. And it's interesting how that changes as well, the perception of time, how that changes perhaps understandings of Gurbani, especially in the Dasam Granth, of what it says, how time is going to unfold. Yep. Certainly Banda Bahadur's conception of that was quite different than the Tat Khalsa's perception of that as well. So, different groups had different perceptions of what time meant for them, which we also have to be cognizant of as well.
Correct.
Last question, and then we'll move on to the second panel. If actually all the second panelists, if you can email your presentations if you haven't, please.
Since you brought up the term Tatta Khalsa, I know the Suraj Prakash, I heard it, also details the split of the Khalsa into the Tatta Khalsa, which in its modern form today is the Buddha Dal and Dal Panth, and the Bandai Khalsa, which was a group of Sikhs who followed Banda Bahadur and accepted him as their guru, and they changed their Barna from blue to red and embraced ideas such as vegetarianism and other things and such, and just strictly followed Banda Bahadur. And along with the idea of how you said year zero became Satyug, where I know in Jobis of Thought it talks about, and other Vedic texts, it talks about how the turn from Kal Yug to Satyug, and the Buddha, how the Panth Pathshah is given the title of Shan Mikror to symbolize that once there are Shan Mikror Khalsa, will be one of the establishment of Khalsa Raj and one step closer to Satyug. And then I believe, if I remember correctly, right at the turn of Kal Yug to Satyug is when Kalki Avatar will arrive, and then from what I remember, basically destroy all of existence, in which the Akal Purkh will create the universe again in a new Satyug, in which, like, if you think about it, it's just a continuous cycle: Satyug, Treta, Dwapar, Kal Yug, Satyug, Treta, Dwapar, Kal Yug, and so on. And I remember I think it was called Ustat, where it talks about how there were many versions of the three Devtas, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, where it talks about how, I can't remember the Pankti exactly, where it talks about how there were many that came before and there will be many after, aside from the ones who we know. I guess what I'm trying to say, cross-referencing these Itihasic Granths with other Gurbani, such as Dasam Bani, all three Guru Granths essentially, and other Itihas, would that be a better pinpoint to establish what Sikhi really is, as compared to reforming it with certain things in the post-colonial era to make it more Christianized in a sense, and as opposed to the Khalsa Panth staying Nyara or different?
Well, there was a lot in there.
But, firstly, in regards to the Bandai Khalsa versus Tat Khalsa, certainly the text, at least from the 19th century, even 18th century, if you think about Bansali Nama, but Ratan Singh Pangu's Panth Prakash, Suraj Prakash, they mention how certainly there were different groups that held different views. So the Banda Bahadur's group didn't necessarily get along with the other Sikh groups at the time. That's well documented in there. And actually, Panth Prakash, it has been translated into English, and that you can look up. So for those that wanted, a gateway into this world of literature, that is the one text that has been translated from that time. So you can Google Ratan Singh Pangu Panth Prakash, and you should be able to find it. It's a reasonable translation. So certainly different groups had different conceptions about time, and it's interesting that you say that, because when you look into, you mentioned that line in Akal was ek shiv pe, ek gay, ek fer pe. So one Shiv came, one went, and another one came. And Shiv being the destroyer of the world, somebody who at the end of these cycles destroys the world. These conceptions of time, in the East where it's cyclical versus in the West where it's linear, that plays a lot into the philosophy, and that plays a lot into why perhaps in India, they may not have thought of history in the same sense that people think about history in the West. And we got that question earlier about perhaps we should just remove the mythological portions of Suraj Prakash. Those conceptions about what is history in a linear sense, that's a very Western concept. And having grown up here, it's for us, the youth, it's very hard to get rid of that. But we should be cognizant of the fact that prior to the British, in India, they had a very different notion of time, which makes this project very interesting because what notion of time are we attributing to the Nanak Shahi calendar? Are we looking at the Nanak Shahi calendar as having perhaps the same mindset that the Gurus had in their time when they were talking about time? Where are we fully being cognizant of how perhaps they viewed, time as cyclical, as perhaps maybe not meaning as much as what people think about time here in the West as a very linear, progressive cycle? These are all just questions that we have to think about. And certainly the portion that you mentioned in Dasam Granth, where it talks about how, Kalki Avatar comes at the end and then the cycle continues, is certainly evidence of the fact that they thought about time as very cyclical and kind of continuing on till infinity. So, yeah, it's just a lot to think about, I guess, if you were trying to make a calendar.
Yeah, I think also one of the things I would like to add is that look at the Gurbani in the larger context and not be selective. I think there's also a reference from Gurbani here, I remember, which is like Kisan Bisan Kabhuna Tyaam Khan Sunet Pehchan Kun So Libla Ki Moni Pakin So, right? So I think Gurbani, I think as I've grown older, one of the things I've explored is like Gurbani is a lot of each time you go through an iteration and you find newer meanings and newer connections to it. And a lot of it is dependent on the state of the mind that you are in at that point of time. So I think there is the faith construct of things, which is like, should Sikhs be allowed to explore Suraj Prakash? I think again, I'm no authority on this, and my brother over here is far more authority, but I think in my personal experience what I found is that I think there is no restriction in terms of what you want to explore. But as a community, as you grow, as a construct, as you grow, as an organized, there are certain things that there needs to be institutions that have to move forward. So that construct has to be kind of taken into account. So it's a fine balance, right? And I think this kind of discussion, I'm glad this is. I think one of the things I loved about Chikara is like this is the place where these kind of discussions can happen in a very, very open manner without going at each other's neck, which is good.
So if I can get a big hand of applause for Next I'll turn it back over to our host, Great Poet Santokh.